Imagine a night somewhere in Central Europe in the spring of 1241. A village is quiet, the fires have burned low, people are asleep in the way people sleep when they don't yet know they're in danger. Children curled against their mothers, old men dreaming whatever old men dream, and somewhere to the east, so far east it seems almost mythological, the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world is rolling westward like a tide that has never once learned the word stop. This is the moment historians keep returning to, not because of what happened, but because of how close things came to happening differently. By the spring of 1241, the Mongol war machine had done something that no force in living memory had managed. It had broken open Europe's eastern door and walked through it like the door wasn't even there. Poland had been shattered. Hungary was burning. The great armies of the continent's kingdoms had met the Mongols on open fields and learned, at tremendous cost, that everything they knew about warfare needed to be urgently revised. Europe in that moment was exposed in a way it had never been before, and arguably never would be again. There was nothing left between the Mongol cavalry and the cities of the West. No wall, no river, no army still standing that could credibly stop what was coming. And then something happened. Or rather, someone died. And what followed wasn't another battle. It was a question so strange and so enormous that historians have been arguing about it for centuries. Did a death in the East matter more than anything that happened on any battlefield in the West? Could it be that Europe was saved not by its knights or its castles or its prayers, but by a drinking habit? By one man's appetite for wine on one particular night? The legend, and it is worth sitting with it as a legend before we examine it as history, is that Ögedei Khan, son of Genghis, ruler of the Mongol Empire, drank himself to death at a critical moment. That his generals, bound by custom and law to return to the Mongolian heartland for the choosing of a new great Khan, pulled their horses around and rode east, away from Vienna, away from France, away from whatever might have come next. It sounds almost too convenient. History rarely hands you a story that clean. But the timing is real, the withdrawal is real, and the question of why, the true why, remains genuinely open in ways that make this one of the great what-if conversations in the study of the past. Stretching across Eurasia in 1241, the Mongol Empire was not simply large. It was staggeringly, almost incomprehensibly large. From the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Central Europe, a single political authority, a single military command, had imposed its will on a landmass that encompassed dozens of cultures, languages, and civilizations. Nothing like it had existed before. Possibly nothing like it has existed since. And it was moving. It was always moving. If you're listening to this right now, I'd genuinely love to know where you are. What city, what country, what quiet corner of the world has you in it tonight? And what time is it there? Is it late? Is it early? Is the room dark around you? Whatever the answer, you're somewhere that in 1241 might have been on a map that a Mongol general was studying with great interest. That connection across time is one of the reasons this story is worth telling slowly, carefully, in the hours made for wondering. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's meet the empire before Europe even knew to look up. He was born, by most accounts, around 1162, somewhere in the vast grasslands north of the Gobi Desert. The exact date is uncertain. The exact location is uncertain. Almost everything about his early life comes filtered through sources written long after the fact, by people with their own reasons to mythologize what they were describing. What we do know is that he grew up in a world of extreme fragility. The Mongolian steppe was a landscape of beauty and brutality in roughly equal measure, where tribal alliances shifted like weather, where a family's fortune could reverse in an afternoon, where the boy who would one day rule half the known world spent part of his childhood as a slave. His name was Temujin. The name we know him by came later, conferred at a great assembly of tribal leaders in 1206, Chinggis Khan, often rendered in English as Genghis. The precise translation is debated, but something in the range of universal ruler or oceanic ruler carries the general meaning. By the time he took that title, he had already done something that many before him had tried, and none had managed. He had unified the fractious, constantly warring tribes of the Mongolian steppe into a single coherent political entity, and he had done it through a combination of extraordinary personal charisma, ruthless military innovation, and a willingness to dismantle the old tribal hierarchies entirely and replace them with something new. The something new is worth understanding, because it's what made everything that followed possible. Traditional steppe society organized itself around bloodlines. You were loyal to your clan, your tribe, your lineage. Chinggis broke this. He built an army organized around units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, where loyalty ran to commanders chosen for ability rather than ancestry. Men from different tribes were deliberately mixed together, their old allegiances dissolved by design, replaced with allegiance to the army, to the campaign, to the Khan himself. It was a radical restructuring, and it worked with a thoroughness that still impresses military historians today. The Mongol warrior was, by the standards of the medieval world, something almost without equal. Not because of individual physical superiority, though the life of the steppe produced men and women of considerable toughness, but because of combined arms coordination, strategic mobility, and intelligence gathering that was simply more sophisticated than what their opponents could field. A Mongol army could cover ground that European armies would have considered impossible. They travelled light, lived off the land and their horses, and communicated across enormous distances using relay riders and a signalling system that allowed commanders to coordinate movements in real time. Before a major campaign, Mongol scouts would spend months mapping territory, identifying political divisions, locating food and water sources, and cultivating local informants. They knew their enemies before the fighting started, often in considerable detail. They also understood psychological warfare with a clarity that was almost clinical. Cities that surrendered were generally treated with some pragmatism, allowed to function under Mongol administration, their skilled craftsmen and administrators preserved for use. Cities that resisted and then fell faced a demonstration of consequences designed to be remembered and repeated. The story of what happened at Nishapur, at Zhongdu, at Urgench, spread ahead of the armies like a cold wind, and many commanders chose capitulation over the alternative. Fear was a force multiplier. The Mongols understood this and applied it deliberately. From the Mongolian heartland, the expansion moved outward in multiple directions over several decades. China to the south, and it would take generations to fully subdue. The Jurchen Jin dynasty, the Western Xia, eventually the Song in the south. To the west, the Kara Kitai. Then, beginning around 1219, the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful Islamic states of the era, controlling territory from Persia through Central Asia. The campaign there was devastating. Ancient cities that had stood for centuries, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, were overwhelmed in succession. The Islamic world, which had its own proud tradition of military sophistication, found itself unable to mount a coherent response. The speed was part of it. The coordination was part of it. But there was also something almost paralyzing about an enemy that seemed to have no fixed center to strike back against, that appeared from multiple directions simultaneously and dissolved back into the steppe before a response could be organized. By the time Chinggis Khan died in 1227, the empire stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. His son Ögedei, elected Great Khan by the tribal assembly, continued the project with considerable energy and organizational ability. Administrations were formalized, trade routes stabilized, and the campaigns continued. The Western campaign that would eventually reach Europe was not an improvisation. It was not a raiding party that got carried away. It was part of a deliberate imperial program to bring the remaining unconquered world under Mongol authority. The generals who led it, Batu and Subutai in particular, were among the most experienced military minds the empire had produced. Europe was not a destination that appeared suddenly on a Mongol map. It had been approaching for years. The question of why the Mongols moved toward Europe specifically, rather than consolidating what they already held, is one that sounds more complicated than it actually was once you understand how the Mongol imperial mind worked. For the Mongols, the answer to that question would have seemed almost self-evident. They moved west because there was west to move into. The fundamental logic of Mongol expansion wasn't territorial ambition in any sense a modern strategist would recognize. It was something closer to a theological and administrative conviction that the world, All of it had been granted to the descendants of Chinggis Khan by a mandate from eternal heaven. Territory that remained outside submission was not neutral. It was unfinished. It was an open account waiting to be settled. Submission meant something precise in Mongol diplomatic thinking. It meant sending envoys, acknowledging Mongol supremacy, paying tribute and providing troops for future campaigns when called upon. The terms were actually workable for many states. Several rulers across Central Asia and the Caucasus had taken this arrangement and survived intact, their administrations absorbed but functioning. What the Mongols found intolerable, the thing that reliably and almost mechanically produced catastrophic violence, was the specific combination of refusing submission and then having the audacity to kill the envoys sent to offer terms. That particular sequence was treated not as a political decision, but as a crime against cosmic order, and it invited a response designed to be permanent. The frontier situation to the west had been building pressure for years before the Great Campaign launched. Out on the steppe, the Mongols had already shattered the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people who had dominated the grasslands stretching from the Kazakh steppe toward the Carpathians. Some Cuman groups had submitted and been absorbed. Others had fled west. A substantial Cuman population under their leader Kotyan had sought refuge across the Carpathian Mountains, asking the Hungarian King Bela IV for protection. Bela accepted them, not entirely without misgiving. He saw strategic value in having battle-hardened steppe warriors as a buffer and as potential cavalry. The Mongols saw it differently. In their view, the Cumans were subjects of the empire who had fled, and Hungary had given shelter to fugitives from Mongol authority. This was not a minor diplomatic awkwardness. It was, within Mongol thinking, an act of aggression. The Rus principalities to the north had already had a preview of what was coming. In 1223, at the river Kalka, a Mongol reconnaissance force under Jebe and Subutai had met a combined army of Rus princes and Cuman allies and destroyed it almost effortlessly. Then, almost inexplicably to the Rus, the invaders had simply withdrawn back eastward. They had not come to conquer, not yet. They had come to look, to test, to learn. The princes who survived Kalka had approximately 17 years to consider what that engagement had demonstrated, and most of them spent that time doing very little constructive about it. Old rivalries between the principalities remained. The political fragmentation that made unified defence essentially impossible was not addressed. The lesson of Kalka largely went unlearned. Subutai remembered everything about Kalka. He remembered the terrain, the political divisions among the Rus, the way different princes had coordinated poorly and arrived to battle at different moments rather than together. He had not been conducting a raid in 1223. He had been conducting a survey, the kind of long-range strategic intelligence gathering that was one of the genuinely unusual features of how the Mongol military planned large operations. Years before an army moved, information moved first. Merchants who travelled as agents, prisoners who were debriefed carefully, envoys whose real purpose was observation as much as diplomacy. By the time the Western campaign launched in earnest in 1236, Subutai had built up a picture of European political geography that was, in some respects, better than what many European rulers had of their own neighbours. The man the operation was formally assigned to was Ögedei Khan, a grandson of Chinggis through his son Joshi. Batu was the nominal head of the house that held claim to the westernmost portion of the empire, the territories that were being conquered into existence as the campaign progressed. He was a capable commander, politically shrewd, and he understood the complexities of managing a campaign that involved not just enemy armies, but also other Mongol princes with their own ambitions and precedence concerns. The Western campaign was in some ways a coalition operation, with senior princes from multiple branches of the Chinggisid family, each contributing forces and each technically sharing in the glory. Managing that particular group required diplomatic skill as much as military genius. The military genius, most historians agree, was Subutai. He was by this point one of the oldest and most experienced commanders in the Mongol world, a man who had campaigned across a wider geographic range than virtually any other general in history to that point. He planned in a way that was fundamentally different from how European commanders conceptualized war. European strategy in this period tended to think in terms of single decisive engagements, sieges, pitched battles on chosen ground. Ögedei thought in terms of multiple simultaneous axes of advance, deception operations designed to fix enemy forces while the real blow landed elsewhere, and long-range coordination across distances that would have seemed implausible to anyone who hadn't seen Mongol communication systems function. He was designing something that looked less like a medieval campaign and more like what later centuries would call operational art. The armies that began gathering in 1236 were pointed first at the Rus. Europe was not yet in their immediate sights, but what happened to the Rus would clear the road, expose the political landscape to the west, and set in motion a sequence of events that would eventually bring Mongol cavalry to the banks of the Adriatic. None of that was improvised. All of it was coming. When the Mongol vanguard crossed into the Volga basin in the late 1230s, they did not arrive as an unknown quantity. Stories had already moved ahead of them. Merchants who'd seen burned cities in Khwarezm. Steppe peoples who'd watched their neighbours shatter and scatter. Rumours of riders who seemed to appear everywhere at once, who could fight for days, whose arrows darkened the sky. And yet, among the Rus princes, those stories did not become a single plan. On paper, the Rus lands were substantial. Forests, rivers, trading towns linked into a network that reached from the Baltic to Byzantium. In practice, they were a jigsaw of semi-independent principalities, each ruled by its own branch of the Rurikid dynasty, each nursing its own quarrels and grievances. Kiev, Vladimir Suzdal, Chernigov, Smolensk, Novgorod, Galicia Volhynia, lines on maps later. At the time, they were rival courts, overlapping claims, brothers and cousins who might be allies one year and enemies the next. The Mongols were not particularly interested in disentangling the subtleties. From their perspective, these were simply nodes in a network that had not yet acknowledged the mandate of eternal heaven. The solution was straightforward: move down the network and break each node in turn. The first great blow fell on the Volga Bulgars, a Muslim trading state that had grown wealthy taxing commerce along the river. They had fought the Mongols before and survived. They would not survive this time. The details are obscure, the archaeology fragmentary, but the outcome is clear enough. Their main centres were taken, their resistance crushed, their land turned into the forward operating base Batu and Subutai needed. Winter quarters, pasture for horses, access to river transport. From this moment on, the Mongols were not merely raiders passing through. They were installed. Then the attention turned north and west toward the forest principalities. The campaign against the Rus is sometimes imagined as a single sweeping invasion. It was in reality a series of meticulously sequenced operations. Columns fanned out, reconvened, split again, moving on ice-hardened rivers and frozen marshes that in summer would have bogged down armies. Winter, which European commanders often considered an obstacle, became a Mongol ally. Frozen ground simplified logistics. It expanded cavalry mobility. It turned the river systems of northeastern Europe into highways. The city of Ryazan was one of the first to face the full weight of this logic. Envoys arrived with terms that had already become familiar across Asia: submit, pay tribute, provide troops, or face the consequences. The princes of Ryazan refused. They asked their neighbours for help. Some answered with words, fewer with soldiers. The Mongols advanced anyway. Later chronicles, written by survivors and their descendants, speak with the voice of trauma. They describe walls ringed with siege engines the defenders had never seen before. Heavy Chinese-style catapults hurling stones that smashed towers and houses alike. Lighter mangonels and traction engines flinging pots of incendiary material that clung and burned even on damp timber. Shielded rams driving into gates. Ladders going up under cover of volleys so dense that, as one chronicler put it, The sky itself seemed to be shot through. The Mongols had learned siegecraft the hard way in the walled cities of North China and Transoxiana. They brought engineers from those regions west with them. What had once been regional Chinese or Persian expertise had been absorbed into a mobile, empire-wide toolkit. Against a wooden-walled Rus town, this was overkill. Ryazan fell. Its destruction was deliberate and exemplary. Many inhabitants were killed. Others were taken as slaves. The city's elite were annihilated, or at least so broken that they ceased to matter. The Mongols were sending a message, one consistent with their doctrine across continents. The penalty for resistance was not mere defeat. It was erasure. That message moved faster than any single army. Refugees fled along the winter roads, bringing stories of what had happened. Those stories did not produce a unified reaction. Some princes tried to fight. Others retreated into their own territories, hoping to negotiate separately, perhaps to offer tribute later. Some may have reasoned that if a neighbour was taken first, they would have more time to prepare or to arrange their own deal. The logic of divided principalities worked exactly as Subutai had expected it to. Each node in the network considered its own survival before the network as a whole. As the Mongol columns rolled westward, they applied the same pattern again and again. Demand submission. If accepted, confirm the prince in his rule as a vassal. Take hostages, levy troops, move on. If refused, isolate the target politically, pin any relieving forces with screening detachments, and then apply siege methods with ruthless efficiency. Kolomna, Moscow, then still a small fortified settlement, not yet the future capital it would become. Vladimir, the seat of one of the most powerful Rus princes. One after another, they were ringed with earthworks, pounded with siege engines, stormed after days or weeks. Where resistance was stiff, the aftermath was harsher. Where gates opened, the treatment might be less apocalyptic, but the basic reality was the same. The political autonomy of the city was over. Kiev, the ancient centre on the Dnieper, the city that once had given its name to an entire realm, learned this late and painfully. For generations it had prospered on trade routes linking the Baltic North to the Black Sea and Byzantium. By the 1240s it was already weakened, its political prominence fading, its economy damaged by shifting routes. But it was still symbolically immense. The Mongols treated it as such. When it fell, after a bitter siege, its churches and palaces were sacked, its population cut down or dispersed. Later travellers would describe Kiev as almost empty, a shadow of what it had been. Behind each ruined city, Mongol garrisons and administrators were left in place or installed nearby among subject steppe peoples. This is easy to miss if you picture the Mongols purely as swirling cavalry. They were also building an infrastructure of conquest. Depots, pasture zones, relay posts for messengers. They used the Volga and Dnieper not just as waterways but as corridors of control. Grain collected as tribute could be stockpiled. Timber from the forest could be turned into siege engines for the next campaign. Local craftsmen could be compelled to work for their new overlords. The conquest of the Rus did not just remove potential enemies, it generated capacity. It gave Batu and Subutai inspected roads, tested routes through forest and marsh, reliable winter quarters much closer to Europe's heartland. It provided them with new auxiliary forces, Rus infantry and engineers, Cuman cavalry absorbed after their defeat, who would march, unwillingly or not, under Mongol banners in the campaigns to come. And perhaps most crucially, it altered the psychology of the region. To the west, in Poland and Hungary, information arrived in uneven fragments. A city burned here, a prince killed there, a refugee caravan with horrifying stories. From a distance, the sequence could look almost random. A steppe horde raiding one area, then vanishing, then flaring up somewhere else. For kings in Krakow or Esztergom, what was happening along the upper Volga or middle Dnieper might feel like distant chaos rather than a coherent unfolding plan. From the Mongol perspective, however, the pieces were fitting together cleanly. Once the forest principalities were broken, the steppe opened from the lower Volga through the Don and Dnieper toward the Carpathians. The shattered Cumans on the grasslands to the south were either dead driven out, or incorporated. The Rus to the north were reduced and cowed. This created exactly what Subutai had been working towards since the first reconnaissance at Kalka, a broad, secure base of operations from which simultaneous thrusts could be launched into Central Europe. One axis would drive through the passes and plains toward Hungary, into a kingdom that had accepted Cuman refugees, and thus, in Mongol eyes, harboured criminals. Another would move into Poland, tying down forces, creating confusion, preventing any clean, unified response. These were not isolated adventures. They were linked operations, synchronized across hundreds of kilometers, coordinated by couriers galloping along newly established relay routes. Back in the ravaged Rus lands, the silence that followed each destroyed city had its own weight. Smoke clearing from blackened beams, empty churches, fields untended because there were too few people left to work them. For those who survived, the empire approaching from the east was no longer a rumour. It was a pattern: envoys, demands, siege engines, fire, submission or ruin. To the west, many still waited to see whether this pattern would cross the next line of forests and mountains. To the Mongol command councils huddled in winter camps along the Volga and Dnieper, that question had already been answered. With the Rus broken and the road clear, the next campaigns were not speculative. They were scheduled. In the courts of Latin Christendom, the Mongols first arrived not as armies, but as names. Tatar, Tatare, Tatari. Sometimes Comans, sometimes confused with older steppe peoples entirely. In letters and sermons they were often called the Tatars, and quietly associated with Tartarus, the pit of hell. The word itself seemed to suggest a place beneath the world, a realm of demons. It was a convenient echo. It made them easier to fit into existing stories. Europe knew something was happening far away. The problem was not total ignorance. The problem was that the knowledge arrived bent and broken. Italian merchants who had once travelled east toward the Black Sea and beyond came back with fragments. Trade routes were disturbed. Cities that used to buy their wares were smoking ruins or occupied by new masters. There had been fighting on the steppes. Some terrifying new power had swept through Muslim lands, crushed kingdoms that had seemed permanent. But what exactly this force wanted, how it was organised, what its long-term intentions were, that filtered westward through layers of translation, rumour and fear. Envoys from the shattered Rus principalities or from displaced steppe peoples sometimes reached Poland, Hungary or the Holy Roman Empire. They carried stories of cities burned in winter, of engines that flung stones heavier than a man, of entire populations removed or slain. But these envoys often spoke languages their host did not. Their words passed through interpreters who themselves might know only part of the story. Names of places were garbled, distances were misjudged. A campaign that had unfolded over several winters could be retold as a single sudden raid. An organised conquest might sound like a series of unconnected disasters. Meanwhile, letters from the Latin Christians of the East, crusader lords, military orders, bishops in the Levant, also spoke of these riders from beyond the Caspian. Some described them as a scourge of God sent to punish the Saracens. Others were not so sure that the Mongols would stop with Muslim lands. Even here, on the edge of the known, certainty was elusive. In Rome, at the papal curia, information arrived late and in conflicting batches. Pope Gregory IX and then Pope Innocent IV received reports that were almost impossible to reconcile. Some said the Tatars were allies in disguise, a potential instrument to break Muslim power and reclaim Jerusalem. Others insisted they were pure enemies of Christianity who had trampled cross and altar alike in the Rus cities. There were stories of Mongol envoys demanding submission in the name of a great Khan. There were also tales, sometimes fabricated, sometimes misunderstood, of strange conversations where Mongol commanders had listened politely to Christian priests, or had spared certain churches, or had asked curious questions about the faith. Each anecdote was seized on by different factions as proof of their preferred theory. To some, this meant the Mongols were on the verge of conversion. To others, it meant nothing more than that they were pragmatic conquerors, willing to use any tool available, even religion. distance did the rest of the distortion. In an age when news travelled at the speed of a horse or a ship, events on the Volga in one winter could still be discussed in Paris or Bologna, as if they were current several years later. By the time a letter warning of an approaching army arrived, that army might already have moved on, burned its way through another principality, and settled into new winter quarters hundreds of kilometres away. Geography, too, created illusions. For a king in England, the vast arc from the Volga through the Rus forest to the Carpathians was a blur of unfamiliar names. He could point to them on a map, perhaps, but they did not feel real in the way that Normandy or Anjou did. For an emperor in Germany, the lands beyond the Oder and Vistula were frontier spaces. Important, yes, but peripheral. If something terrible was happening out there, perhaps it would burn itself out before reaching the Rhine, and in the space between far away and too late, human habits moved in. European rulers were used to certain patterns of threat. Armies usually came from places they recognized: rival kingdoms, neighboring dukes, the emperor, the Pope's supporters or his enemies. Even when they thought about Islam, they thought of it in terms of familiar adversaries: Ayyubids in Egypt and Syria, Almohads in Iberia. These enemies had capitals, they had diplomatic traditions, they fit into a known chessboard. The Mongols did not. They had no embassy in Rome, no long-standing quarrel with any particular European dynasty. They had not been present at earlier crusades. They were not a known quantity in canon law or imperial diets. They seemed to come not from one kingdom but from the horizon itself. So when early rumours reached Central Europe that some vast horde had destroyed the kingdom of the Rus and was now moving toward Poland and Hungary, many rulers tried to interpret this within their existing framework. Was this just another wave of steppe raiders like the Pechenegs, the Cumans, the Magyars of centuries past? Dangerous, yes, but ultimately prone to either settle or be bought off? Or was this something like the apocalyptic wars described in Revelation, a sign that the end times were near, in which case normal politics hardly mattered? Prophecies and sermons bloomed in the uncertainty. Some preachers described the Mongols as Gog and Magog, those mysterious northern nations long associated in Christian imagination with end-of-the-world invasions. Monastic authors leafed through their copies of the Book of Daniel, trying to match visions of beasts and horns to current events. Had not some earlier writer said that before the end, terrible unseen peoples would be unleashed from beyond distant mountains? On the other hand, certain practical-minded clerics and princes preferred to see the Mongols as a tool in God's hand rather than the final enemy. If they were scourging the pride of the Rus and the Muslims, perhaps that punishment would not need to fall on Latin Christendom itself. Perhaps prayer, repentance, and some modest fortification work would suffice. Underneath the religious interpretations, another more familiar pattern quietly persisted: rivalry. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope were locked in their own protracted struggle for authority. Kings in France, England, and the Iberian realms were occupied with dynastic concerns, regional wars, and the endless negotiation of feudal obligations. In Central Europe itself, the Polish duchies were famously divided among competing Piast branches, and Hungary had its own internal tensions between crown and magnates, between settled nobles and newly arrived steppe allies like the Cumans. When letters began to circulate urging unity against the Tatars, they had to pass through these webs of suspicion. If a German prince called for a common army, did he intend to use it against the Mongols, or was this a pretext to assert influence over Poland? If the Pope urged crusade-like mobilization, would that come with demands about church rights and tithes that kings were reluctant to grant? If the Hungarian king asked for help, did neighbouring rulers worry that a strengthened Hungary would later become a rival? From the Mongol perspective, these questions were irrelevant. They were planning a synchronized campaign in which each column knew its axis of advance, its rendezvous points, its seasonal objectives. Batu and Subutai could rely on a single, if sometimes contentious, command structure that ultimately answered to the Great Khan's authority. Disputes within the Mongol leadership existed, but they were resolved within a frame that still prioritized the overall campaign plan. In contrast, Europe's response was patched together from overlapping sovereignties. No single person could order all Christian princes to act in concert. The Pope could exhort, threaten excommunication, promise spiritual rewards. The emperor could summon imperial vassals, kings could call on their tenants-in-chief, but each layer came with delays, negotiations, exceptions. The result, as winter turned to spring in the early 1240s, was a landscape in which fear was widespread but focus was not. In some places, royal chancelleries drafted urgent letters in Latin describing horrible people unknown to us called Tatars who have destroyed many kingdoms and are now at our borders. In others, local lords simply strengthened a few castles, stockpiled grain, and hoped to ride out whatever storm approached. Peasants heard only that some monstrous riders had appeared in the east and that God was angry. Some joined processions and fasts. Others quietly considered whether their village, tucked into a valley or a forest, might be too small and remote to attract such distant wrath. No council gathered all the relevant information into a coherent map. There was no unified strategy that said, "They have taken the Volga Bulgars, subjugated the Rus, broken the Cumans, and now, logically, the next open doors are Poland and Hungary." Instead, those kingdoms appeared almost accidentally placed in the path of a wandering catastrophe. But they were not accidental in Mongol calculations. Hungary had accepted Cuman refugees, whom the Mongols now listed as their subjects who had fled judgment. Poland occupied key passes and river crossings that could anchor flanking operations and complicate any westward European concentration of forces. To Batu and Subutai, these were natural next targets in a sequence already tested across Asia and the steppe. To Latin Christendom, however, Poland and Hungary were simply frontier realms with familiar local quarrels, until the day riders bearing unfamiliar standards appeared on their soil. In that gap between what the Mongols were doing and what Europe thought they were doing lies the story of the next battles. Poland would feel the first concentrated blow at a place called Legnica. Hungary would become the main arena at the river Sajo, near a village called Mohi. Only then would the scale of the misunderstanding become clear, and by then, for many, it would be far too late to correct it. By the time the first Mongol scouts rode into Polish lands, the winter snows were still clinging to the shaded edges of fields and forest. Villagers were just waking up from the cold season, ploughs being dragged out of sheds, oxen tested on the softening ground. No one out there in the furrows knew that, hundreds of kilometres away, a man named Subutai had been drawing imaginary lines across maps and mental landscapes, and that one of those lines passed straight through their countryside. From the Mongol point of view, Poland was not the main objective, it was a flank. Hungary, with its plains and its Cuman refugees, was the central prize of this western campaign. But a central strike without secure flanks is a kind of invitation. European armies could have ridden north and south of the Carpathians to converge on the Mongol host in Hungary. Polish duchies, Silesian forces, German knights from the Empire could have mustered along the Oder and Vistula, and then moved to support the Hungarian king. So Subutai did what he had done in China, in Central Asia, among the Rus. He did not simply charge toward the main target. He extended his hand outward, sending separate columns into Poland and Moravia, using them as scouts, raiders, and, if the opportunity arose, executioners. In Poland, that outstretched hand arrived in the form of several Tumans under commanders like Baidar, Kadan, and Orda. Their mission was not entirely straightforward to later historians. Some chronicles describe them as if they were a wandering band of raiders, but the pattern of their movement hints at something more deliberate. They probed, scattered, and drew in. The first contacts came in the early months of 1241. Light cavalry moved quickly through the borderlands, brushing aside small garrisons, burning towns that tried to resist, bypassing those that did not matter. They struck at places like Sandomierz and other settlements on the road west, demonstrating the same harsh logic seen in the Rus campaigns. Those who resisted could expect severe punishment. Those who fled left empty shells where cities had been. Word spread along village paths and churchyards. Stories raced faster than horses. These riders did not lay siege in the way people here understood sieges. They did not show up with weeks of lumbering baggage trains first. They appeared suddenly, tested defences, and if they found weakness, they poured through. In a more centralised kingdom, these early signs might have triggered a coordinated response. In Poland, power was divided among branches of the Piast dynasty, each with its own sphere: Krakow, Silesia, Greater Poland, and other regions governed by dukes who were technically kin, practically rivals. One of the strongest among them was Henry II of Silesia, called Henry the Pious. He ruled from Wrocław and Legnica, building up his duchy with German settlers, towns and churches. In some sources, he appears as the natural leader of resistance, the man with the resources and prestige to gather forces under a common banner. But Henry did not sit at the head of a single obedient kingdom. He had to persuade. He sent letters, summoned vassals, called on neighbours. Response times varied. Some nobles were eager to fight the strange enemy. Others were cautious, or simply slow to mobilise. The wider Holy Roman Empire was itself busy. Not every German prince was willing to ride east on short notice for a threat that to them still seemed far away. The Mongol columns didn't wait. They moved across southern Poland in long arcs, sometimes splitting, sometimes rejoining. One group burned through Lesser Poland, threatening Krakow. Another pushed towards Silesia. Along the way they fought small battles and skirmishes at places like Tursko and Chmielnik, where local levies and hastily assembled knights tried to block them. These early clashes did not end in heroic standoffs. They ended in routs. Polish forces were often surprised by the speed and flexibility of the enemy. They were accustomed to steppe raiders who might appear suddenly, steal livestock and vanish. They were less prepared for enemy units that could break off in different directions, coordinate across distances, and then reassemble at prearranged points as if following an invisible timetable. Every minor defeat had a secondary effect. It drove frightened survivors westward, where they arrived in market squares and bishops' halls with breathless accounts of disaster. Each story made it harder for dukes further west to pretend that this was some localized raid that would burn itself out on the frontier. Henry the Pious understood that the storm would not simply pass him by. He gathered what he could: his own Silesian knights, town militias, some contingents from Greater Poland. He was joined by allies whose presence looms large in later retellings: a band of Templar and Hospitaller knights, volunteers from German lands, perhaps also a contingent from Bohemia, under the youth Boleslaus, son of King Wenceslas, though whether they arrived in strength or too late is debated. What is fairly clear is that Henry's army, while not small by regional standards, was not the full potential of Latin Christendom. It was a patchwork force, assembled in haste, standing in for an absent coalition that never quite formed. The battlefield where they met the Mongols would be remembered as Legnica or Liegnitz in Silesia on April 9th, 1241. Imagine the scene in the cool spring air. Henry's host advances, banners of cities and lords fluttering, the cross displayed by the military orders, the creak of armour and the snorting of horses. Many in this army have never seen a Mongol before. Their mental image is drawn from sermons and rumours, wild barbarians, perhaps brave but disorganised, who might crumble at the charge of heavily armed knights. Across the field, Mongol commanders measured them with older eyes. They had seen many such armies, the flower of Khwarezm's nobility, heavy cavalry from Rus princes, even disciplined infantry from Chinese cities. And they had developed a set of responses that were as much psychological as tactical. At Legnica, those responses were put into practice. The battle, as reconstructed from fragmentary sources, seems to have unfolded in stages. The Mongols began with missile fire, their horse archers riding in loose formations, loosing shafts and then withdrawing before a direct clash. This was not random skirmishing. It was designed to test the enemy's reactions and to invite a particular mistake. Henry's men, under pressure and perhaps frustrated by the harassment, launched charges, powerful localized thrusts of heavy cavalry designed to break enemy lines. Against slower or less disciplined foes, such charges could be decisive, but the Mongol lines did something that defied the expectations of many European knights. They bent and gave way, then seemed to flee. This was the feigned retreat, a maneuver the steppe peoples had refined over centuries, but which many Western commanders still had not internalized as a standard trick. It required not only individual skill, but also high-level coordination. Units had to withdraw in apparent panic, but in reality maintain enough coherence to wheel, regroup, and re-engage on cue. Some of Henry's contingents, seeing the enemy running, pursued with enthusiasm. In the fog of battle, the dust of hooves, the confusion of language, the scattered shouts of different banners, it was easy for parts of the army to surge forward out of alignment with the rest. At some point in this swirling confusion, the Mongols turned. Fresh units, held in reserve or concealed by terrain, struck the flanks and rear of the now extended Christian formation. The apparent fugitives wheeled back. Horse archers closed in from multiple sides, their arrows finding gaps in armour, unprotected mounts, men who had outpaced their supports and now found themselves surrounded. Chroniclers mention a kind of smoke or gas being used, a detail that later grew into legends of poison smoke or demonic fumes. Some historians think these references may indicate simple burning materials used to create visual confusion, or perhaps an early form of incendiary device adapted from Chinese warfare. The exact nature is uncertain, but the effect in the sources is consistent. Disorientation, panic, the sense that the battlefield itself had turned uncanny. Command control frayed. Some contingents tried to retreat in good order and were cut down. Others fought on in small knots until overwhelmed. Henry the Pious himself refused to flee. He is said to have fought surrounded by his retainers until he was killed, possibly by an arrow, possibly in close combat. Later stories described his head being displayed on a spear before the Mongol camp, a grim, theatrical message to surrounding populations. The loss was not merely tactical, it was symbolic. Here was a respected duke, with knightly orders at his side, defeated in a single afternoon by an enemy many had still hoped would prove vulnerable to straightforward courage. The road into Silesia and beyond suddenly looked open, yet for all the lurid details that medieval writers later attached to Legnica, when we strip away embellishments, certain things stand out with more secure clarity. The Mongols did not linger to occupy Silesia permanently. They plundered, burned some locations, and then moved on. They had no interest in getting bogged down in long sieges of every fortified town. Their aim in this theatre seems to have been disruption, to prevent the coalescing of a large relief army for Hungary, to terrify, to fragment, and then to rejoin the main forces to the south and east. The battle was thus not an isolated sideshow, it was a piece of a coordinated design. While Henry was falling at Legnica, the central Mongol host was already moving toward a crossing of the Sajo River, where the real decision for Hungary would be contested at Mohi. Legnica was one of several blows, timed so that Europe could not easily gather its scattered fists into a single punch. In the months and years that followed, the memory of Legnica changed shape. Monastic chroniclers, writing with the benefit of hindsight and sometimes with an eye toward moral lessons, emphasized different aspects. Some presented Henry as a martyr-like figure, a Christian prince who died defending the faith against almost apocalyptic invaders. Others embellished the cruelty of the Mongols, adding anecdotes of atrocities that may have attached to Legnica stories from other battles or from distant campaigns. Legend magnified numbers. Later accounts sometimes spoke of the Mongol host as if it numbered in the hundreds of thousands, reducing the Christian dead to a tiny remnant. Modern estimates, based on logistics and comparative sources, tend to suggest a more modest but still formidable Mongol force, and an opposing army sized proportionally to a regional power, not to all of Europe. Still, certain psychological truths embedded in the legends seem accurate. For communities in Central Europe, news of Legnica arriving by rumour, by panicked survivor, by letter, confirmed that this enemy could shatter not only distant Rus princes, but also their own dukes and knights. It undermined the quiet hope that the Mongols might somehow be turned back before reaching the heartlands. If Henry of Silesia could not stop them, who could? At the same time, the fact that the Mongols did not stay to rule Silesia created its own kind of confusion. To those who had expected conquest in the familiar medieval pattern, defeated rulers replaced by new lords who then collected taxes and held courts, it seemed inexplicable. An army that crushed a duke, burned a swathe of territory, and then vanished toward another front did not fit easily into people's categories. Legnica thus left behind a double imprint: dread of a foe whose battlefield methods seemed unsettlingly clever, and puzzlement about what that foe ultimately wanted. In the short term, the lesson for Latin Christendom was not yet fully learned. Warnings from Poland would travel to courts further west and south, mixed with exaggeration, garbled by distance, but carrying a clear core. The Tatars could defeat heavy cavalry, could break a feudal host, could appear and disappear with disconcerting speed. And even as those messages spread, the main event was unfolding in Hungary, where King Bela IV was about to discover that, compared to what waited on the great Hungarian plain, Legnica had been only a flank action, a terrible warning shot that few had time or unity to heed. When the first reports of Tatars reached the Hungarian court, King Bela IV was already a man under pressure. He had inherited a kingdom that looked strong on parchment maps: broad plains, river valleys, silver mines, busy market towns. But under the surface, things were fragile. His father, Andrew II, had spent much of his reign in generous moods, handing out royal lands to nobles and favourites in great parcels. It bought loyalty in the short term. In the long term, it hollowed out the crown. Royal revenues shrank. The king's direct control over vast stretches of countryside weakened. Powerful magnates became semi-independent lords in their own right, with private fortresses and private grudges. Bela had tried to reverse this. He pushed back against the largest grants. He tried to claw lands back into royal hands, to restore something like the older, stronger monarchy. Nobles who had grown used to their new estates did not appreciate the change. Some called him Bela the Reckless behind his back. He was pious, reform-minded, but not universally loved. And then, on top of these internal battles, came a request from the edge of the known world. South and east of Hungary, between the Carpathians and the steppes, lived the Cumans, nomadic, Turkic-speaking peoples who had long been both raiders and mercenaries, enemies and sometimes allies of the Rus and Hungarians. They were steppe riders too, but not Mongols. When the Mongol advance pressed into their grazing lands, Cuman groups broke and fled westward, pushed like waves before a storm. Sometime around 1239 to 1240, their leader, often named Köthen or Kuthen in Western sources, appeared in Hungarian territory with a large following and a desperate offer. "Let us in," he essentially said. "Give us land to settle. In return we will serve you as warriors. We will be your shield against the invaders behind us." For Bela, this looked like both an opportunity and a risk. On one hand, a mass of seasoned horsemen could strengthen his army, especially in the very kind of warfare the Mongols excelled at. On the other, the Cumans were feared and disliked by many Hungarians. They dressed differently, rode differently, worshipped differently. For decades, villagers in the borderlands had known them as raiders. Now Bela was talking about welcoming them as neighbours. He chose to accept them. He had Köthen baptised, married him into the Arpad royal family and granted his people lands on the Hungarian plain. It was a strategic gamble, turned former raiders into frontier guardians. Not everyone was ready to follow him in that gamble. Hungarian nobles distrusted the newcomers. Townspeople worried. Rumours spread that the Cumans were in league with the Mongols, that this refugee wave was actually a Trojan horse. Mongol envoys arriving in Hungary did nothing to calm the mood. They kept insisting that the Cumans were their subjects, fugitives who needed to be handed back. They warned Bela that harbouring them was the same as defying the great Khan. There is a moment in some chronicles where Bela and a Mongol envoy exchange messages that read like the prelude to a tragedy. The envoy demands submission. Bela refuses. Instead, he appeals to the Pope and Western rulers for help, writing letters that describe the Mongols as a scourge threatening all Christendom. He doesn't just frame this as a Hungarian problem, he frames it as a European one. The answers that came back were sympathetic, but slow, cautious, and often limited. Promises of aid, hints of crusading rhetoric, but little in the way of immediate, concentrated military help. Many princes had their own disputes. Some didn't quite believe the scale of the danger. Others may have quietly hoped that if the Mongols did strike, they would spend their fury on Hungary and then go away. By early 1241, the Mongol columns were converging on the Carpathians. One force came through the Veriki Pass in the northeast. Others probed different crossings. The kingdom's warning systems, scouts in the mountains, frontier garrisons, were not built for an enemy that could move this fast, split and rejoin, feign retreat, and then reappear elsewhere. A few fortresses resisted and were bypassed. Open country was simply ridden over. Bela called the nobles. He summoned the royal banderia, the county levies, the church contingents. He expected, or at least hoped for, a great host under a single banner, a field army that could meet the invaders in one decisive engagement. What he got was uneven. Some magnates came late, some not at all. Others arrived with private quarrels still simmering between them. The Cumans, meanwhile, found themselves the target of rising hostility. Towns accused them of pillage. Nobles whispered that they were spies. In the tense weeks before the main clash, violence finally broke out in the capital, Esztergom. A mob of Hungarians attacked Khuton's retinue. The Cuman leader was killed. Whether murdered outright or lynched in confused circumstances is hard to say, but the result was the same. His people, enraged and terrified, did not stay to fight for the king who had failed to protect their chief. They began to leave Hungary, burning and plundering as they went, heading south toward the Balkans. The allied cavalry force Bela had hoped for dissolved into angry flight at precisely the moment he needed it most. With his kingdom's best potential light cavalry gone, with his barons sullen and divided, Bela marched eastward toward the Sajo River, near a village later remembered as Mohi. There, in April 1241, he tried to block the Mongol advance. The Hungarian army encamped on the western bank of the Sajo near a bridge. They had wagons, they had infantry, knights, archers, contingents from various counties and prelates. They built a fortified camp using their wagons as a sort of moving palisade, a technique seen elsewhere in Europe. If they could hold the river line, they might force the Mongols into a costly crossing. On the other side of the water, Subutai and Batu surveyed the situation. Batu, a grandson of Chinggis Khan, was the senior prince. Subutai, the older general, was the mind that had traced those imaginary lines across Eurasia. Together, they decided not to hurl the entire host at the bridge in a straightforward rush. That would have been exactly the kind of fight a prepared defender might welcome. Instead, they set about turning the Sajo from a barrier into a trap. During the night, the Mongols executed a plan that many sources describe with a note of reluctant admiration. One part of their force moved toward the main bridge, making enough noise and movement to suggest that this would be the focus of an attack. Another part, led by Subutai, scouted for and found a ford or secondary crossing point upstream, where the river could be bridged or waded by cavalry. Accounts differ in their exact details. Darkness and confusion do that to history, but the pattern is consistent. While Hungarian scouts and outposts watched the known crossing, thinking they had pinned down the enemy's options, Subutai's men worked through the night, building a makeshift bridge or clearing the way at the alternative crossing. Under cover of darkness, large numbers of horsemen slipped across. Before dawn, Mongol forces struck the main bridgehead, prompting a Hungarian response. Bela's commanders sent troops to repel what looked like the crucial assault. There was fierce fighting there. At some point, Hungarian forces actually pushed the Mongols back from the bridge, perhaps even believing they had won a local success. But that clash was not the whole battle. It was an opening act. As the sun rose and the Hungarians tried to make sense of what was happening, the second part of Subutai's design unfolded. The flanking force that had crossed at the hidden point swung around toward the Hungarian camp from an unexpected direction. What had been a linear confrontation along a river line began to twist into a tightening curve around the Hungarian position. Inside the wagon fort, order frayed quickly. Different contingents had different understandings of the plan. Some sources suggest that Bela and his closest advisors wanted to hold the camp and fight defensively. Others indicate that parts of the army tried to sally out to break the encirclement with charges. In the press of men, horses, wagons, and smoke, coordination all but vanished. Mongol engineers brought up stone throwers and other siege equipment, weapons they had been using in Chinese and Central Asian campaigns for years. Under their bombardment, sections of the wagon wall broke. Horse archers poured arrows into dense clusters of men and animals. Fires started in the camp. Panic grew. Encirclement is not an abstract concept when you can feel it tightening around you. Knights trying to form up for charges found themselves hemmed in by their own baggage, by fleeing infantry, by burning wagons. Attempts to break out collided with other units attempting the same thing in different directions. Each effort that failed left an opening that the Mongols exploited, riding into gaps, shooting, then wheeling away before a coherent counterattack could form. At some point, the Hungarian camp ceased to be a defensive structure and became a trap. The river at their backs limited escape routes. The Mongols, having crossed in multiple places, could block those exits with speed. What had begun as a plan to hold a line of water ended in thousands of men crushed together on a killing ground. King Bela himself only escaped with difficulty, fleeing west with a small escort, shedding royal insignia to avoid being singled out. Many of his leading magnates did not escape. The Archbishop of Esztergom, Grin, is often listed among the dead. So are numerous barons, county heads, and men who had been pillars of the realm's military strength. In a single day, Hungary's main field army was shattered. The aftermath inside the kingdom was a kind of slow-motion disintegration. With the central host destroyed and so many lords fallen, there was no longer a coherent force to contest the Mongols in open battle. Fortified places, a few stone castles, monasteries, hilltop strongholds, could and did resist, sometimes successfully. But the countryside between them lay open. Mongol units fanned out across the great Hungarian plain and beyond. Villages burned, market towns were sacked, monasteries were looted. The population, caught between fear and flight, tried to hide in marshes, forests, or behind the walls of whatever strong point was nearest. In some regions, famine and disease followed the initial violence, as burned fields and disrupted trade broke the patterns that kept people fed. Modern historians debate the exact numbers, but nobody questions that the human cost was severe. Archaeological layers show destruction. Contemporary letters speak of desolation, of empty lands, of churches cast down. For Bela, who eventually fled all the way to the Croatian coast and sought refuge under the walls of coastal cities, the experience was shattering enough that in later years he would be called a second founder of Hungary, because so much had to be rebuilt from near ruin. From the Mongol perspective, the victory at Mohi did something important. It proved that they could do in the heart of Central Europe what they had done on the steppes in Khwarezm among the Rus. They could defeat a Christian kingdom's main army in the field, bypass strong points, and roam freely through productive land. Combined with Legnica to the north, Mohi suggested a disturbing possibility, that there was no natural line in Europe where this momentum would simply stop. If a coordinated relief army had assembled from Germany, Bohemia, Austria, and Hungary together, perhaps the story would have been different. But Mohi showed that such a coalition had not formed in time. Regional powers were isolated, reactive, and still learning who and what they were facing. In the quiet that came after the screams, in the smoking ruins of towns and in the hurried councils of Western courts, one realization slowly took shape. The idea that mountains, rivers, and heavy-armored knights would automatically shield Latin Christendom from the fate of distant Asian kingdoms no longer felt secure. If the Mongols chose to push deeper, past the shattered plain of Hungary, into Austria, into the German lands, perhaps even toward Italy or further, there was no obvious reason, from the record of Mohi to assume they could not. The largest empire the world had yet seen had reached the doorstep of Europe's heartlands and found the door at Mohi not locked but standing ajar. In the months after Mohi, Hungary was not so much a kingdom as a landscape being erased and redrawn in real time. Winter came, but it did not bring safety. In earlier wars, cold weather had often meant a pause, rivers freezing into barriers, roads turning to mud or vanishing under snow, armies pulling back to winter quarters. The Mongols did not do this in the way European rulers expected. They rode on. Some detachments built camps and bases, others kept moving, small, fast columns radiating out from the main force, following river valleys, whipping along frozen ground that now functioned as a hard, clear highway rather than a bog. There are accounts of Mongol horsemen appearing in midwinter in places where no enemy had been seen in living memory, riding through snowdrifts, their ponies adapted to harsh climates from the Mongolian steppe to the Russian forests. For the people of Hungary, the seasons blurred into one long emergency. Fields lay black and unploughed where fire had passed. In some counties, entire villages were abandoned. Survivors hid in reed-choked marshes along the Tisa, in the swamps of the Savis and the Danube floodplain, in forest clearings that did not appear on any charter or survey. Nobles who had boasted of their lineages now clung to the same dripping tree roots as their peasants, praying that hoofbeats would pass them by. Monasteries that had once been centres of learning and liturgy turned into fortresses of last resort. Their stone walls, originally built to house relics and echo with chant, now sheltered frantic families, carts of grain, livestock crammed into cloisters. Bells rang not for processions but as alarms. Yet even these strongpoints were selective islands in a sea that the Mongols now navigated almost at will. They did what they had done in Rus, avoided hard nuts until they were ready, and cracked the easier shells first. Wooden palisades burned quickly. Earthworks were overrun. Stone kept out fire, but it had to be thick, high, and properly supplied to hold out for long. Hungary had castles and fortified towns, but nowhere near enough of them, and many were not designed with this kind of systematic, mobile siege warfare in mind. Bela, stripped of his army and much of his authority, fled westward. For a while he moved from place to place inside his shattered realm, always one step ahead of the advancing riders. When that became too dangerous, he crossed into Croatia, then pushed on to the Adriatic. There, under the walls of coastal cities that looked out over a quiet, moonlit sea, he tried to negotiate aid from Venetian and Dalmatian powers, a king without a kingdom, appealing to merchant republics whose priorities were trade routes and harbours more than inland battlefields. Behind him, the Mongol tide did not stop at the line of the old Hungarian frontier. It pressed into the surrounding world, testing its edges like water searching for cracks. To the west, scouts and raiding columns probed toward Austria. Vienna, which you might picture today as a placid imperial city, then lived with rumours running ahead of reality. Stories arrived before soldiers did. Refugees spoke of horsemen like a storm, of entire counties gone silent. Austrian and Bavarian lords began to strengthen river crossings, to gather contingents along the Danube, to look nervously east each time a rider appeared on the horizon. Mongol parties rode into the lands of Duke Frederick II of Austria, Frederick the Quarrelsome, a man better known for feuding with neighbours than uniting them. Some chroniclers describe skirmishes, burning villages, small clashes near the border. The core of the Mongol host did not crash straight into Vienna's walls, but the path to the city had been scouted, its approaches mapped in the minds of men from the steppe. To the southwest, other detachments turned through northern Croatia, along the Drava and Sava valleys, reaching toward the Adriatic sphere. They appeared near the fringes of Dalmatian towns, in territories that connected the Hungarian plain to the maritime world of Venice and the Latin East. Along the coast, ship captains stared inland from their decks and saw smoke columns where inland settlements once had stood. The sea for the moment remained a barrier the Mongols did not cross, but the idea that the Mongol storm was purely a land problem, contained by distance, was starting to fray. If you stood in a German principality, or in northern Italy, and tried to imagine the map in early 1242, it might have looked something like this. To the east, a great hollowed-out space where a kingdom had been. To the northeast, Poland and Silesia reeling from Legnica. To the southeast, rumours of movement down toward the Balkans, and in the middle of all this, the knowledge that the same army had already marched from the frontiers of China. So the question that people began to whisper in courts and cloisters was simple. How far could this go? Some saw a direct road from the Hungarian plain into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. The Danube flowed like a stone-paved highway, pointing toward Regensburg and beyond. If the Mongols could ride along it the way they had used the Volga and other great rivers, might they not reach deep into German lands? Towns such as Passau, Linz, even Regensburg itself, appear in later accounts as places that might have been next, had the invaders chosen to push a little further. Italy, too, did not seem impossible in imagination. The Alps, with their snow peaks and treacherous passes, had often been invoked as a natural shield. But people knew, even then, that shields are relative. Hannibal had led elephants over those same mountains. German emperors rode their armies through them to be crowned in Rome. If disciplined infantry and pack animals could cross, why not expert steppe riders with engineers and siege trains? Milan, Venice, Bologna, Papal Rome, names that would later echo with Renaissance art and politics, now appeared in some minds as possible future battlefields. Modern historians are more cautious. They point out that even the Mongols, with their extraordinary mobility, faced practical limits. Horses must eat. A Mongol army was not just thousands of men, but tens of thousands of animals. Each rider typically had several mounts. Grasslands are generous to such forces. Mountainous forests, fragmented fields, and densely settled river valleys are more complex. To push beyond Hungary in a sustained way, they would have needed to solve a problem that grows sharper with every mile, feeding that living engine of hooves. Then there were fortifications. Unlike the broad open steppe and many regions of Rus', Central Europe west of the Carpathians grew progressively denser in stone-walled towns and hill castles. The Mongols were not helpless before stone. They had siege engineers familiar with Chinese techniques, with counterweight trebuchets and mining skills. But each serious siege cost time and manpower. Each garrison left behind to hold a bridge, a city. A pass was a slice cut out of the main host. Supply lines stretched. Communications back to the core of Mongol power lengthened. Winter roads could be fast and hard, but spring thaws turned some routes to mud. In Italy especially, with its mountains and rivers twisting in every direction, keeping a large mounted army fed, coordinated and effective would have been a logistical feat even for them. Still, the people living then did not have access to neat diagrams of logistical strain. They had rumours, letters, and their own fears, so chroniclers often set aside constraints and let their imaginations run along the most alarming lines. Some wrote that, had God not intervened, the Mongols would have taken all of Germany, then France, then Spain, driving the faithful to the edges of the Western Sea. Others pictured them riding down into Italy, trampling the papal states, silencing the bells of Rome. A few speculated even more broadly, that no Christian land would have remained untouched, that the entire oikumen, the known inhabited world, would have been gathered under the rule of the great Khan. Those hyperboles tell us more about fear than about precise plans in Batu's tent. But fear itself shapes history. Princes who had ignored Bella's early warnings now read his desperate letters again, this time with a different understanding. Cities along the Rhine discussed their walls. Italian communes, already accustomed to mercenary companies and shifting alliances, considered what it would mean to face enemies who were neither Guelph nor Ghibelline, neither imperial nor papal, but something wholly other. Europe in 1242 felt, to many of its inhabitants, like a continent standing on thin ice. They knew now that the surface could crack, that a power from far beyond their maps had reached their centre and found it vulnerable. Whether the next step would send that power crashing westward, or whether the ice would somehow hold, was not yet clear. In the Mongol camps on the Danube and the Tisza, in the makeshift winter quarters scattered across the ruined plain, that same question hung in the air in a different form. Not, could we go on? For their experience suggested they could, but should we, and how? The answer would not come from any Hungarian village or Austrian border tower. It would drift in from far away, from the distant heart of the Mongol Empire, bearing news of a death that would change the fate of an entire continent. The message travelled not on parchment first, but in memory. A rider appears in some outpost camp far to the east, his pony lathered, its flanks crusted with frozen sweat. He carries a tablet, or a knotted cord, or simply the authority of the man who sent him. He speaks, and what he says will be repeated, camp to camp, fire to fire, until it reaches men who have never seen the Kerguelen River, who were children when Temujin was alive, but who know the weight of one particular title. The great Khan is dead. To understand why those words could tug at the reins of armies camped beside the Danube, you have to go back to a very different landscape, to a cold plateau in eastern Mongolia, to a man who was never supposed to be the most famous figure in this story. Ögedei was not the charismatic founder. That was his father, the man we call Genghis Khan, whose name still echoes in a way his son's does not. And he was not the brilliant general on the Western Front. That role belonged to his nephew Subutai, the mastermind of the Rus campaigns and the European invasions. Ögedei's power was quieter and more structural. When Temujin died in 1227, he left behind more than conquered tribes and shattered kingdoms. He left behind a question. Who would bind these expanding circles of conquest into something that did not fly apart? At a great assembly, the Kuriltai, of nobles and princes, Ögedei was chosen as Great Khan. His brothers and relatives accepted it, some more willingly than others. Under steppe tradition, that acceptance mattered. It meant that when he spoke with the authority to assign campaigns, to confirm or strip titles, to decide which branch of the family would lead which army and govern which province. Ögedei oversaw the completion of the conquest of northern China. He ordered campaigns into Korea, into the lands of the Jin, into Khwarezm and beyond. From his new capital of Karakorum he sent out commands written on tablets of wood and metal, sealed with the imperial tamga. The empire under him was still, in some ways, a moving camp, but that camp had a centre. The centre was Ögedei, and Ögedei, as those around him never tired of commenting, drank. The stories about his cups are everywhere in later chronicles. A man who had wine brought in by the cartload, a ruler whose physicians begged him to slow down, who tried to regulate his consumption by serving his alcohol in huge but supposedly limited vessels, like trying to control a flood by giving it prettier banks. Persian historians under later Mongol dynasties describe him as a generous, easygoing man fond of banquets. Chinese sources note his indulgence. Mongol traditions themselves do not hide it. They speak of a great Khan who could be jovial and open-handed, but also increasingly captive to the rhythms of the drinking hall. Was he a drunk in the cartoonish sense you'll find in popular retellings, a staggering caricature who somehow, in one sloppy evening, saved Europe by dying at the right moment? That image is more folklore than fact. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this. Ögedei's health was poor in his later years. He drank heavily. He also suffered from other physical ailments. Death from complications related to alcohol in a man whose body is already under stress is entirely plausible, even likely. But the neat picture of a single binge, a single night, a single cup too many, this is the way humans tell stories afterward, not necessarily the way biology plays out. In late 1241, while Batu and Subutai were in the west, while Hungarian towns faced the cold eye of winter under strange banners, Ögedei died. The exact day is usually given as December 11th. He was somewhere around 55 years old. For the Mongol Empire, this was not just the loss of one man. It was the removal of the keystone from an arch that had been widening for 2 decades. Steppe empires before the Mongols had a pattern. A strong leader unites tribes, raids outward, conquers neighbours, then dies. Without a clear successor, the coalition phrase, sons fight brothers, uncles fight nephews, vassals test the leash, enemies on the borders breathe a little easier. Temujin understood this pattern and tried to break it. He imposed a law code, the yasa. He wove a new identity around his followers, less tribal and more imperial. He also chose consciously to designate Ögedei as his successor even before his own death. It was an attempt at preemptive order. For a time, it worked. Under Ögedei, the empire did not collapse, it expanded. But that expansion only delayed the underlying tension. Each success created more territory to divide, more offices to grant, more streams of tribute that different branches of the family could argue over. By 1241, the empire stretched from the borders of Korea to the edge of the Hungarian plain. Its ruling elite were all in some way descendants or relatives of Genghis Khan. Batu in the west, Chagatai's line in Central Asia, Ögedei's own sons in Mongolia and China, Tolui's sons just coming of age. This was not a neat hierarchy so much as a tangled, overlapping web of prestige and expectation. Ögedei's death snapped one of the key strands. Under Mongol custom, a new great Khan could not simply be named in a darkened chamber. The major princes and nobles had to gather in person at a Kurultai. It was not just ceremony, it was political engineering. Getting powerful men to sit together on the same windswept plain, to drink and talk and argue, was the way you manufactured consensus, or at least the appearance of it. So when word spread to the distant armies in Rus and Hungary that Ögedei was gone, it carried with it another unspoken command: come home. Because if you did not come, if you sent excuses from the banks of the Danube while your cousins and rivals carved up influence at Karakorum, you risked more than impoliteness. You risked being sidelined in the new order, or even declared a problem. We do not possess a verbatim transcript of the moment when Batu heard the news. Later writers imagine him standing by a frozen river, frowning over a dispatch. Others place the revelation in a more formal council. In truth, we only see the shadow. Some time after reports of Ögedei's death reached the western host, the internal dynamics of the Mongol elite began to press in on the war in Europe. Batu was not just a general rampaging at the fringe of the world. He was a grandson of Genghis, the senior figure of the Yotkid line. His family had their own ambitions. Some sources hint that his relationship with Ögedei had already been strained, that they had argued over spoils, timeframes, or status. If that's true, then the death of Ögedei did not just mean return to obey the new ruler. It meant return to help decide who that ruler will be, and how much he will owe you. This is where the legends, the simplified classroom narratives, and the more cautious reconstructions begin to diverge. In the simplified version, the story goes like this. Ögedei dies. The Mongol princes are legally obliged to stop whatever they're doing and hurry back to Mongolia. Therefore the armies withdraw from Europe. One man's drinking problem spares a continent. It's a clean, satisfying arc. It explains a terrifying near miss with a single pivot. It turns an abstract succession issue into something personal and almost moral. Europe rescued by the excesses of a distant emperor. But history at this scale rarely turns on one hinge alone. Modern historians point out that by the time news of Ögedei's death reached Batu, much of the European campaign's first phase had already achieved its immediate objectives. Rus had been smashed, Hungary had been neutralized, intelligence had been gathered. The logistical difficulties of pushing deeper west, which we just traced, were growing more obvious. There are indications that Subutai was already considering a shift in focus toward the south, into the Balkans and Byzantine zones, places that could be approached from other directions as well. So was the recall for the Kurultai the sole cause of the western withdrawal? Or did it provide a timely, politically legitimate reason to end a campaign that was approaching the edge of its sustainable limits? The sources do not answer that cleanly. Some accounts, especially those written by frightened Europeans soon afterward, stress the divine timing of the Khan's death, framing it as a miracle. Mongol and Persian sources, writing later and often with their own dynastic perspectives, mention the recall to Mongolia, but do not suggest that Batu threw down his plans overnight and galloped home at maximum speed. What we can say with some confidence is this. The death of Ögedei created a succession problem that every senior member of the imperial family had to care about. It turned long-distance campaigns from purely military questions into political gambles. Stay too long on the Danube, and you might find the throne decided without you. Return promptly, and you preserved your voice in the council that would shape the next decades. For Europe, this invisible debate in distant yurts translated into something very concrete. The gradual drawing back of forces that had seemed unstoppable only months before. In the quiet that followed, chroniclers reached for explanations that fit their world. Many of them settled on one image: a great Khan who died of drink, his last cup spilling like a libation over Christendom, putting out the fire at its borders. It is a compelling picture. It is also, at best, a partial truth. Behind that cup lies a whole machinery of steppe politics, inheritance customs, family rivalries, logistical calculations, and contingent choices. Whether Ögedei's final illness saved Europe, or whether Europe would have broken the Mongol advance on its own hard stones and narrow passes, remains a subject of debate rather than certainty. What is clear is that his death changed the conversation inside the Mongol world, and from that change flowed the next decision Batu and his fellow commanders had to make as they sat in their winter camps, to keep pushing westward into the unknown, or to turn their horses' heads toward home. Somewhere in a frozen camp on the Hungarian plain, the fires burn low. Horses stand with their tails to the wind, steam curling from their nostrils. Armour is stacked, saddles are propped on poles to dry. Men sleep in shifts, and in the great felt tent at the centre of one of these camps, Batu and his closest companions are talking. We don't know their exact words, no one wrote down the minutes, but we do know the pressures that would have been sitting in that tent with them, invisible but heavy, like extra guests around the fire. The first of those pressures was obligation. Under Mongol custom, the death of a great Khan was not the end of a story. It was the opening of a dangerous new chapter. A Kuriltai had to be held, a great assembly of the royal clan and the leading Noyans. Attendance for the most powerful princes was not optional, in the way a modern conference might be optional. It was an expectation backed by the possibility of force. Because the Kuriltai was where status became concrete. Who sat closest to the new ruler? Whose daughters were married into which line? Who received governorships and new appanages, and who saw their territories diminished? To be absent was to let rivals speak for you, or worse, to let them speak about you without challenge. Batu, as the senior Jochid, had more reason than most to care. His Ulus, his portion of the empire, lay in the west. The newly conquered Rus, the steppe north of the Black Sea, the long rivers that led down toward the Caucasus. These were rich graze lands, future tribute streams. The exact boundaries and rights associated with them were not yet frozen in law. They would be hammered out, at least in part, in the political bargaining that followed Ögedei's passing. And Batu's relationship with Ögedei had not been entirely smooth. Some accounts describe friction over the scale of the Western campaign, over the division of spoils, over Batu's reluctance to be treated as a mere commander rather than as a prince in his own right. If those tensions are even half accurate, then the implications are obvious. With Ögedei dead, Batu could not assume that the next great Khan would be automatically friendly to his interests. He would need to be there, in person, to shape the outcome, or at least to prevent outcomes that were disastrous for his branch of the family. So the recall to attend a Kuriltai was real and serious. But that does not mean the decision that followed was simple. Because there were other pressures in the tent that winter. One of them was Subutai's sense of the campaign itself. The armies that had struck Poland, smashed Hungary, and raided into Croatia were not infinite. They were powerful, yes, and frighteningly mobile. But they were also operating hundreds of miles from their primary base zones. Their horses were grazing on unfamiliar pastures. Their supply lines, such as they were, stretched back through devastated lands. Mongol warfare depended on grass as much as on steel. An army of tens of thousands, each warrior with multiple mounts, was essentially a vast moving ecosystem of animals and men. They needed space. They needed fodder. Winter pastures, summer pastures. A miscalculation could mean thousands of horses weakening, then dying, and an army's striking power evaporating with them. The Carpathians and the forests beyond were not the open, rolling steppe. Pushing deeper into the knot of Central Europe would mean threading between mountains, rivers and cities that did not fit neatly into steppe patterns of movement. Add to this the sheer depth of the advance. From their starting points on the Volga and in southern Russia, the Western armies had driven a spear almost to the centre of the continent in just a few years. Every new mile of conquest added new responsibilities: garrisons to leave behind, tribute systems to establish, routes to secure, hostile pockets to monitor. At a certain point, an army can become like an overstretched arm, its hand far ahead of its shoulder. Some historians, looking back, see in the timing of the withdrawal a campaign that had reached the natural edge of what was sustainable in a first thrust. The Mongols had learned a great deal. They had tested European armour and tactics. They had mapped routes, assessed fortifications, taken prisoners who would later serve as guides and interpreters. They had terrorised, weakened, and divided. From this perspective, even without a death in Karakorum, a pause might have been prudent. Now put these strands together in that winter council. On one side of Batu sit Subutai and other experienced commanders, men whose first instinct might be to continue the work, to exploit momentum, perhaps to turn south into the Balkans where the terrain and political landscape was somewhat more familiar thanks to previous contacts. On the other side, or perhaps in the same men's minds, are the political calculations. Ögedei is dead. His widow Turrigen is manoeuvring in Karakorum. Tolui's sons, including the formidable Munka, are coming of age. The Chagatayids in Central Asia will have their own views. The longer Batu stays in the west, the more the future of the empire hardens without his hand on the mould. And then there is the formal obligation, the summons to a Kuriltai. Later chroniclers, especially in Europe, would smooth all these threads into a single rope. The Mongols withdrew because their emperor died, they would write, sometimes in tones of wonder. But inside the Mongol world, the choice probably felt less like an order obeyed and more like the convergence of multiple incentives. If Batu wished to strengthen the Oshid position, he needed impressive conquest to point to, proof that his line deserved wide domains. The European victories gave him that. Hungary lay shattered. Poland had been taught a terrifying lesson. Rus was firmly under his shadow. To push deeper, at increasing logistical cost through a still unknown web of kingdoms, might bring diminishing returns. On the other hand, a complete abandonment of the West was not in his interest either. The lands already taken, the tribute already flowing, were the foundation of his future authority. The solution that emerged was not the dramatic sudden flight that later imaginations sometimes picture. It was more gradual, more layered. The main expeditionary forces turned back eastward. Some detachments continued raiding for a time, probing and burning as they withdrew, leaving a wake of fear to magnify their apparent power. Garrisons and overseers remained in the Rus territories. The infrastructure of the Oshidulus on the western steppe began to crystallize. From Europe's perspective, the effect was still astonishing. Armies that had seemed poised to roll over Vienna and perhaps beyond were, within a year or two, gone from the Danube front. Chroniclers, lacking access to Mongol politics or to the quiet arithmetic of grass and distance, reached for explanations that made sense to them. Some framed it as divine intervention, others accepted reports that the emperor of the Tatars had died and that his princes were compelled by their own laws to return. A few noticed that raids and pressure continued on the fringes and wondered if the storm had truly passed or merely moved. Modern historians debate the balance of causes. There is a succession-first school, which emphasizes the compelling force of the Kuriltai summons and the central role of dynastic politics. In this view, if Ögedei had lived 10 more years, European history might look radically different. There is another approach that sees the recall as one factor among many, important but not solitary. Campaign fatigue, the onset of spring floods, the destruction already inflicted on key targets, the need to consolidate gains in Rus and along the steppe frontier, all of these in this reading nudge the scales. Some scholars note that Batu never actually went all the way back to Karakorum for the next Kuriltai. He halted on the Volga, establishing his power base there. He sent envoys and representatives rather than his own person. That detail complicates any simple story in which an iron law dragged him irresistibly from Europe to Mongolia. Maybe, they suggest, Batu used the summons the way a skilled politician uses a convenient excuse, as a publicly acceptable reason to do something he already, for other reasons, preferred to do. Others push back, arguing that we should not discount Mongol legal and ritual norms just because they do not fit modern images of realpolitik. The obligation to participate in the choosing of a new great Khan was not a trivial matter to men whose authority rested on descent from a single ancestor and on the shared rituals that bound that family together. What almost no serious historian claims anymore is that there was a single, simple cause that can be captured in one sentence. He drank too much and died, so the armies went home, is the sort of tale one tells for comfort or for drama, not for accuracy. Instead, we are left with a more complex picture. A vast empire suddenly missing its central figure, princes calculating their futures across thousands of miles, generals counting horses and fodder, looking at maps drawn in charcoal on felt. An enemy, Europe, that had been blooded but not systematically conquered, its potential resistance only partly tested. A set of customs that demanded consultation and consensus at key moments. A network of rivalries and loyalties that made absence in those moments dangerous. Out of all that, a decision: turn back. For those living in the villages and towns of Hungary and Poland and Austria, it must have felt as if a hand had been lifted from their throats. The riders who had appeared like a nightmare were receding. Smoke still hung over ruined places, but the horizon, for the first time in years, did not constantly darken with dust plumes. Sleep, which had come fitfully under the sound of distant hooves, began to return. Yet even in that quiet the story was not finished. The empire that had touched Europe's border was not broken. Its lords were gathering far away on a cold plateau to decide among themselves what would come next. And in those distant discussions, Europe still had a place, if only as a direction on the compass, a set of possibilities waiting beyond the line where the last scouts had turned their horses around. So let's set the tent walls back up for a moment. Let's imagine that winter council going differently. The messengers from the east still arrive. The news of Ögedei's death still spreads like a cold wind through the ranks. The obligation to attend a Kurultai is still there, heavy as ever. But in this version, Batu and Subutai look at their maps, at the grazing grounds, at the prisoners who have described to them in rough outlines the lands beyond the Carpathians, and they choose to stay a little longer. Not forever, not with perfect confidence, just long enough to see what lies on the far side of the mountains when the snows melt. History doesn't give us that spring, but we can walk through its possibilities. When the thaw comes, the Mongol armies are still in Hungary. The first thing they would have met, almost certainly, is mud. The same Carpathian passes that funneled their invasion in 1240 to 41 become swollen with meltwater. Roads such as they are turn to soup, wagons bog down. But Mongol forces are less dependent on roads than their European counterparts. Their horses can pick a way along ridgelines and meadow edges, following paths that don't appear on any Latin charter. From the Hungarian plain, there are several doors into the rest of Europe. One leads west, along the Danube toward Austria and the rich core of the Holy Roman Empire. One curls south and west toward Croatia, the Adriatic, and the northern fringes of Italy. Another threads north of the Carpathians, through what is now Slovakia and southern Poland, linking back to the routes they have already scouted around Krakow and Silesia. Which one would they have taken? We can't know. But we can weigh the terrain and the temptations. The Danube Valley, with Vienna as its prize, would have been an obvious corridor. Wide river, settled lands, a string of towns, monasteries and castles fat with stores. Duke Frederick II of Austria, sometimes called the Quarrelsome, had already skirmished with Mongol forces on the border. His lands were on their mental map. Northern Italy, on the other hand, shimmered in medieval imaginations as a place of almost unimaginable wealth. Cities like Venice, Milan, Bologna, and Padua were flourishing, linked by trade to the Mediterranean and beyond. The Mongols already had envoys probing contacts with merchants from those same networks further east. The idea of reaching those markets from the landward side might have appealed, and there was the easier option, circling back into Poland and Bohemia, lands they had already struck, finishing unfinished business, tightening their control over the northern approaches. Whichever direction they chose, they would have carried with them the same toolkit that had shattered Rus and Hungary. Scouts riding days ahead of the main forces, screens of light horse archers fanning out like a tide, probing for weak points, feigned retreats to draw defenders into ambushes, siege engineers, many of them Chinese or Central Asian, with their stone-throwing mangonels and knowledge of how to weaken walls with mining and fire. Against this, Europe would have offered something slightly different from what the Mongols had faced further east. On the one hand, there were more stone fortifications, castles on hilltops, walled towns with narrow gates and strong towers. Some of these were crude by the standards of Chinese frontier fortresses, but they were still more substantial than the earth and timber defences of many Rus towns. On the other hand, there was deep political fragmentation. Germany was not a single tightly controlled kingdom. It was a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, and minor lordships, all technically under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire, but often more concerned with local rivalries than with distant threats. Italy was similarly divided. Communes in the north, the papal states in the centre, rival noble families at each other's throats. Fragmentation had already helped the Mongols in Poland and Hungary. Local rulers had struggled to coordinate. Messages took days to travel. Suspicion and grudges slowed everything. Those same patterns would likely have repeated further west. So which regions were most at risk? The open lands closest to the Hungarian plain, the Austrian marches, Moravia, perhaps Bavaria's eastern valleys, would have felt the first shock. Villages along the Danube might wake one morning to see smoke on the horizon, the black shapes of riders where they had expected only traders and pilgrims. Lightly fortified monasteries, used to thinking of their stone walls as protection against bandits, would discover they were only speed bumps to an army that could ring them with horse archers and batter their gates with captured timber in a day. But further in, the picture blurs. Cities like Regensburg, Nuremberg, or Cologne, with their stone circuits and dense urban populations, would have been harder nuts to crack. Not impossible. Mongol siege techniques were sophisticated, but slow and costly. Slower still if word had time to spread ahead of the armies. One of Europe's few advantages was population density. Not in the sense of enormous cities, that crown belonged to China and parts of the Islamic world, but in the sense of a crowded countryside filled with people who could, in extremis, be armed. A Mongol Tumen, maybe 10,000 strong on paper, was a terrifyingly efficient killing machine in the open, but in the narrow lanes of a stone-built town or against a determined militia behind walls, the arithmetic shifted. Manpower was not Europe's weakness. Coordination was. If a string of princes, bishops, and city councils could for once put aside their quarrels long enough to assemble a joint army and choose a commander they trusted, they might mass tens of thousands of armoured knights and infantry. On a flat field charging unthinkingly at a mobile enemy, those knights would likely suffer the same fate as at Legnica and Mohi, drawn out, encircled, annihilated. But if they learned, if the reports from Hungary and Poland were heeded, if commanders began to understand that chasing a retreating Mongol line was often walking into a trap, if they used terrain, forests, rivers, marshes to anchor their flanks, if they recognized that sitting tight behind fortifications and forcing the enemy to do the hard work of sieging multiple points at once might be wiser than seeking glorious battle, then the story becomes less one-sided. Would European leaders have adapted that quickly? Some probably would, others almost certainly would not. Medieval Europe was not a single rational actor, coolly updating its tactics based on incoming information. It was a mosaic of people with different experiences, different temperaments, different access to intelligence. That variability is part of what makes the counterfactual so hard to pin down. What seems likely, though, is that conquest, in the sense of fully absorbing Central and Western Europe into the Mongol administrative system, as they did with northern China or Khwarizm, would have been a longer, messier affair than a simple straight-line arrow on a map. More plausible, at least in the medium term, is something between full annexation and a mere raid. The Mongols had a flexible repertoire. Sometimes they installed direct governors, levied taxes, and turned local elites into their own agents. Sometimes they settled for tribute and submission. Local rulers kept their thrones, but acknowledged Mongol overlordship, paid regular sums, and provided troops when called. Sometimes they simply devastated and moved on, leaving behind terror and ruin, a warning to others. Central and Western Europe offered potential for all three. Rich bishoprics and cities might have been prime targets for tribute arrangements. It is not hard to imagine a frightened bishop in Passau or Mainz agreeing to pay annual gold and grain in exchange for a promise to be left unburned. Border realms like Bohemia, Austria, or perhaps even some Italian communes might have been pressed into becoming vassals, their rulers travelling east to bow before a Mongol prince, returning with seals and titles they could show off to their neighbours. Deep penetration and long-term garrisoning of, say, France or England would have posed different challenges. Sea crossings were not a Mongol strength. Western Europe's Atlantic fringe was, in some ways, a cul-de-sac from the perspective of a Eurasian steppe empire. The easiest profits lay sooner, on the nearer side of the continent, so we can picture a patchwork outcome. Areas closest to the steppe frontier and to the established Joshid base in the Russlands might have come under something like the later Golden Horde pattern. Tribute-taking, overlordship, relatively light direct administration. Further west, repeated raiding, demands for submission, and the occasional catastrophic sack of a major town might have become grimly familiar rhythms. Over decades, some European polities might have accepted this as the new normal and reoriented their politics around appeasing or outmanoeuvring their distant horse-lord overlords. Others might have hardened into resistance, turning their forests and mountains into refuges, their monasteries into fortress monasteries, their cultures into ones that remembered the Mongols not as distant legends but as present threats. And through all of this, Mongol power would not have been static. Just as Europe was fragmented, so was the empire behind the invasion. The Yokids, the Ögedeids, the Toluid line that would give rise to Kublai, the Chagatai princes in Central Asia, all had their own agendas. Internal wars between Mongol factions in the later 13th century were not hypothetical, they happened. A western frontier more deeply entangled in those struggles might have seen European rulers playing a dangerous diplomatic game, sending envoys east with gifts and flattery, backing one Khan against another, the way Italian city-states later played off France and the Habsburgs. In this light, the question, what if the Mongols had stayed, becomes less about a clean alternative history where Europe simply falls or simply survives, and more about an extended period of mutual testing. On one side, a mobile, highly organised military culture, expert at steppe warfare, adaptable in siegecraft and accustomed to ruling through fear, flexibility and tribute. On the other, a patchwork of societies that, for all their disunity, had deep reserves of manpower, growing economic capacity, and a tradition of building in stone. The counterfactual is compelling not because it has a single neat answer, but because it throws both sets of strengths and weaknesses into sharper relief. It reminds us that Mongol armies were not an unstoppable force of nature. They were human organizations bound by logistics, seasons, horses, and politics. And it reminds us that Europe was not simply a helpless victim, saved only by luck and the sudden death of a distant ruler. Under enough pressure, its princes, bishops, city councils, and commoners might have found new ways to cooperate, to fortify, to endure. We don't know how far the riders would have gone if they had not turned back that winter, to Vienna, to the Rhine, to the walls of Milan or the gates of Paris. What we do know is that the moment of contact revealed vulnerabilities on both sides, and even in their absence the echo of hooves would go on shaping decisions in courts and councils for generations to come. When the riders finally did vanish from the Hungarian plain, they did not take the memory with them. They left behind something harder to uproot than any camp or palisade. They left questions. What exactly had just hit them? Could it come back? And if it did, could anything be done differently? For Hungary, those questions were not abstract. The kingdom was a wound, villages gone, fields empty, whole counties reduced to charcoal outlines and stone foundations. King Bela IV, who had fled west in panic as his army collapsed at Mohi, came back to a land that barely recognised him. But the shock had shaken something loose in him as well. Before 1241, Hungarian kings had been wary of letting their nobles fortify themselves too heavily. A realm full of private castles looked, from a royal point of view, like a realm full of possible rebellions. Stone was power, and power was to be hoarded. The Mongols reversed that equation. Now the danger was not over mighty vassals, but an enemy who could ride across the open plain as if it were a floor with no furniture. Wooden palisades burned. Earthworks split. Only a handful of stone fortresses and walled towns had offered real resistance during the invasion. So Bela began to think in stone. He invited settlers from the west, Germans, Slavs, even Cumans who had once been steppe rivals of the Mongols, to repopulate the empty lands. He offered privileges, tax breaks, land. On one condition in particular: build strong. Over the next decades, Hungary saw a wave of castle building that would earn Bela the later nickname the second founder of the state. Hilltops sprouted keeps. Old earth and timber forts were refaced in masonry. Towns were allowed, even encouraged, to encircle themselves with walls. A bad memory was being translated into architecture. It wasn't just about quantity, it was about placement. Castles studded the Carpathian passes, the river crossings, the ridge lines that once had been highways for fast-moving horsemen. Monasteries became fortified islands. Royal residences were moved from vulnerable lowlands to more defensible heights. The Hungarian plain could never be turned into a mountain, but it could be turned into a chessboard dotted with pieces that blunted open riding. This was, in a sense, an admission of weakness. Hungary was saying, we cannot stop such an army in the field, but we can force it to slow, to break into smaller detachments, to face more sieges than it can efficiently supply. A kingdom that had learned, in one burning season, how lethal overconfidence could be, began quietly building itself into something harder to sweep aside. Other regions watched. The shock of 41 to 42 rippled along the diplomatic and ecclesiastical networks that tied Latin Christendom together. Letters went out carrying rumours that blurred and exaggerated, but rarely understated what had happened. Papal correspondence described Tartars who drank blood, who spared neither monk nor maiden, who seemed to appear and vanish like a plague wind. Bishops in Germany and Italy read these lines with a mixture of horror and professional curiosity. What did one do with such a threat? In the short term, there were spiritual responses, days of prayer, calls for penitence, attempts to interpret the catastrophe as divine punishment for sins or as a prelude to the end times. But underneath the sermons, more pragmatic currents flowed. Military thinkers, yes, there were such people even then, began piecing together reports from Poland, Hungary, the Rus. They noted the mobility, the reliance on horse archers, the feigned retreats, the refusal to be drawn into disadvantageous ground. Some of this knowledge found its way into chronicles and treatises, obscure to us now but part of the quiet learning of the age. Advisers murmured to princes, "Do not chase them too far, do not let them encircle you, do not waste nights in glory charges across open flatness." Responses were not just military. Rulers who had barely known where Tartary was on a map started sending envoys east. At first, they went in fear to investigate, to see whether submission was required. Later, they went with more complex motives. The papacy, always thinking in terms of souls and frontiers, saw in the Mongol courts a possible wedge into the Islamic world. If these horse lords could be converted, or at least allied, perhaps they could be turned against common enemies. Letters went out to Khans, carried by friars who walked and rode thousands of miles to present Latin arguments before people who had never heard of Rome. Italian city-states, ever alert to trade, saw something else. Behind the terror was a network. The Mongol Empire and later its successor Khanates knitted together caravan routes from the Black Sea to China. A dangerous master, yes, but also a gatekeeper to silks, spices and furs. so merchants from Genoa and Venice edged into ports on the Black Sea that lay under Mongol shadow. They negotiated trading privileges with Joshid princes. They learned that beneath the mailed fist there were also account books and customs posts. The power that had terrified Europe at Mohi and Legnica began, over time, to acquire a second face, that of a distant, formidable neighbour with whom one could also bargain. This did not mean safety. Raids into Poland and Hungary continued in later decades. Border zones lived with the constant possibility that one summer a new army might materialise. But those same raids also functioned as reminders, keeping the memory of the first disaster from fading entirely into legend. And memory matters. In some places, 1241 became a cautionary tale. Hungarian chronicles emphasised the folly of ignoring warnings, the chaos of uncoordinated defence, the king's initial reliance on open-field battle against an enemy who specialised in devouring such hosts. Later writers, looking back, cast Bela's rebuilding as repentance and reform. In Poland, the death of Duke Henry the Pious at Legnica could be read as both tragedy and moral lesson. Chroniclers debated whether his fall was due to personal failings, to the sins of his people, or simply to the inscrutable will of God. The Mongols themselves become almost secondary in some tellings, a rod in the divine hand. Elsewhere, the story hardened into myth. Tales circulated of monstrous riders from the ends of the earth, children of Gog and Magog, harbingers of the Antichrist. Details shifted with each retelling: invulnerable armour, fire-breathing horses, sorcerous tactics. The true, human nature of the invaders was sometimes lost under layers of apocalyptic paint. Providential interpretations also offered a strange kind of comfort. If Europe had been spared full conquest because God, in his wisdom, had called Ögedei from the world at precisely the right moment, then the terror could be folded into a larger narrative of protection. A disaster, yes, but also a reminder that history was not random, that unseen hands still guided the fates of kingdoms. At the same time, practical men did not rely entirely on providence. They drew boundary lines, negotiated truces, paid tributes when they had to. They fortified river crossings. They tried, with mixed success, to improve communications so that news of distant threats might travel faster than the threats themselves. And always, in the background, was the knowledge that the great empire to the east did not simply vanish after 1242. The Ögedei realm in the steppes north of the Black Sea, the polity later called the Golden Horde, loomed over Eastern Europe for generations. Rus princes journeyed to its camps to receive confirmation of their titles. Polish and Hungarian rulers calculated their policies with an eye to whether the horde was riven by civil war, distracted by internal succession disputes, or united under a strong Khan. Mongol envoys sometimes arrived in European courts, mysterious figures from a world most Latin nobles would never see. They brought demands or offers of alliance or trade propositions. Their presence, however rare, was a reminder that the line between terror and diplomacy could be thin. Looking back, it is tempting to see inevitability, to say, Europe would have developed stone fortifications, improved its cavalry tactics, and expanded its diplomacy eastward anyway. That Mongol pressure was just one more stimulus in a long, complicated process. There is some truth in that. History rarely hinges entirely on a single event, a single death, a single decision. And yet, Ögedei's fatal drinking bout in a distant capital shifted the balance of attention within an empire that, at that moment, had Europe in its sights. Batu's decision to turn back, whether driven by politics, logistics, winter, or ambition, closed a door that had only just opened. The riders withdrew, but their brief, devastating passage left grooves in the landscape of European politics that would shape later paths. Hungary's choice to become a land of castles rather than a king's open park. The papacy's cautious dance between fear of Tartars and hope for alliances. Eastern Europe's centuries-long entanglement with steppe powers, in which tribute, trade, and warfare mixed uneasily. Even the imaginative geography of Latin Christendom, its picture of where danger lived, of what kinds of enemies might appear out of the dark, was altered. Beyond the familiar Muslim adversaries of crusading rhetoric, there was now another possible invader, one that needed to be understood, categorized, folded into prophecy and policy alike. All of this from a campaign that, in the end, stopped short. One winter council, one imperial succession crisis, One set of calculations about pasture, prestige, and the risks of overextension. That is the unsettling part. The history of continents can bend around choices made in tents and palaces far away, by people who never hear the names of the towns their decisions will spare or destroy. Europe in 1241 did not deserve to survive or fall. It was fragile and resilient, divided and inventive, capable of both folly and adaptation. The Mongol Empire, for its part, was not a machine grinding inevitably westward. It was a web of human ambitions, rivalries, and constraints. The terror of that year forced both sides to reveal something of themselves, and then, just as suddenly it left, leaving Europe to rebuild not in the shadow of conquest, but in the echo of a near miss. If you close your eyes now and run the story backward, it starts to feel even stranger. Think of the riders on the Danube, the banners in the snow, the smoke over Pest. Then imagine the same dust rising over Vienna, over Prague, Regensburg, Nuremberg. Imagine the same horns sounding outside the walls of Paris. We don't know how far the wave would have rolled if it hadn't stopped in 1242, historians argue. Some suggest that pasture limits, forested terrain, and the density of stone castles in Western Europe would have slowed the Mongols, forced them into a pattern of raiding and tributary demands rather than outright replacement of ruling elites. Others think the armies that shattered Hungary and Poland, given time and reinforcements, could have repeated the pattern farther west. What we can say with some confidence is that the door was open. The kingdoms beyond the Carpathians and the Oder had not yet absorbed the lessons Hungary and Poland were just beginning to learn. Their fortification programs, their diplomatic approaches, their tactical thinking were still calibrated for enemies they already knew, neighbouring princes, imperial rivals, Muslim powers in Spain and the Mediterranean. Against that background, the withdrawal of 1242 looks, in retrospect, uncomfortably like a coin toss that came up in Europe's favour. That's where the phrase "one drunk Khan saved Europe" comes from. It's a shorthand, a way of taking the messy tangle of succession disputes, long-distance logistics, winter ice, and elite rivalry, and compressing it into a single vivid picture. Ögedei, with the wine cup that finally did what cold and exhaustion and battle had failed to do. There is a certain rough justice in that image. His death really did matter. It shifted attention back toward Mongolia at precisely the moment when the Western armies were poised to push further. It gave Batu and other princes both an excuse and a reason to turn away from Europe and toward the question that mattered most inside the empire: who would be Great Khan next and under what terms? But if we stop there, if we say Europe was saved by a hangover and close the book, we miss where the story is most human. Ögedei's drinking only mattered because of how the Mongol state was built. Because this empire, for all its terrifying coordination and speed, still rested on personal relationships between khans and kinsmen, on a system where every new ruler's legitimacy had to be hammered out in councils of horsemen who weighed their own interests along with any abstract ideal of unity. Succession politics pulled the reins. Strategy tightened or loosened them. Batu had already shown that he could calculate. He knew how far his supply lines now stretched, how thin his horses would graze if he pushed into regions with less pasture, denser forests, more stone strongholds. He knew what it meant to keep an army in the field year after year, with no clear end in sight. The environment added its own quiet vote. Those same Carpathians and rivers that had frozen into highways in the winter could, in a different season or a different campaign, become barriers. Western Europe offered rich targets, yes, but also landscapes that did not always reward steppe tactics. Wetter climates, thicker woods, shorter grass, places where a horse empire might still strike hard, but would have to think more like a siege army, less like a storm front. And then there is contingency. The awkward word historians use when they mean it could easily have gone otherwise. If Ögedei had lived another 10 years, if Batu had been more willing to gamble on overruling his rivals, If pasture had been better in one crucial season, or a promising lead army west had scored a decisive victory that made skeptics fall in line. You can stack those ifs until they make you dizzy. Step back from the details and look, for a moment, at the outline. At its greatest extent, the Mongol Empire stretched from the shores of the Pacific to the edges of the Adriatic world. From forests where reindeer moved between lichen and snow to rice paddies in southern China. From Persian deserts to Rus birch woods. Half the known world looked up, in one generation, and saw some version of the same banners on their horizon. Europe, for once, was not the centre of anything. It was a fringe, a promontory at the edge of a much larger system whose rhythms were set in Karakoram and on the steppe. The thing that is hard to hold in your mind, lying in the dark, is how easily that fringe could have been folded in more tightly. How quickly the familiar map in your head, France, Germany, Italy, sitting around the table of medieval history as the default guests, could have been rearranged, demoted, absorbed into a different story altogether. That didn't happen, because a Khan drank too much, because his relatives distrusted one another, because horses need grass and mountains are stubborn, and winter comes when it comes, because men in tents half a continent away weighed honour and fear and future advantage, and decided, after all, to ride home instead of west. There's something both comforting and unsettling in that. Comforting because it reminds us that no empire, however vast, moves like a machine. There are always cracks where choice and chance can wedge themselves in. Unsettling, because it means the world you know, its borders, its languages, its old stories about who conquered whom, is not the only way things might have turned out. It is one branch on a tree that could have grown very differently. Tonight, you followed one of those branches from the Hungarian plain back to a drinking cup in Mongolia, and outward again across an empire that paused for breath at Europe's edge, then turned away. Before you drift off, if you'd like to help this little corner of the internet keep telling such almost didn't happen stories, you can tap like, or leave a comment or subscribe so you can find your way back here next time. And if you feel like sharing, write in the comments where you're listening from, somewhere in Hungary or Poland, or far beyond the old lines of the Mongol frontier, another small dot on a map that, long ago, almost had a very different shape.